So after making that video on the top 10 drivers of the 80s, where I committed the cardinal sin of ranking Prost ahead of Senna, I decided it was time again to stir the shit with you lot. The 1990s saw some legendary characters enter the fray, mixing it up with some of the 80s heroes that we saw earlier. So, out of all the drivers that took part in the 90s, which of them did it the best in this decade? And not overall. Please, I don't want to have to explain this shit again. Now, before we delve into the top 10, let's first have a look at some honourable mentions. Olivier Panis, a little too French on some occasions, but wicked fast in the Ligier and Prost teams, getting a win at Monaco after starting 14th. Johnny Herbert did exceptionally well for a guy who was lucky to still have his feet after a crash at Brands Hatch in '88, winning a couple of times in his Grand Prix career, including once in a Stewart, which was one of the strangest races in Grand Prix history. Heinz-Harald Frentzen, more like Heinz-Harald Hopeless for a lot of the 97 season, but he still achieved 3 wins in the 90s, which is exactly 3 more than I have, so I'll go f myself. Eddie Irvine, granted, not the best example of a Ferrari driver, but he did put on some good performances in his time, and was in the running for the title back in 1999 against the might of Mika Hakkinen.
The formula now is a mess. There's just too much.
Nelson Piquet, for dragging the best results out of the machinery he was given, marching on from where he was in the 80s, and Taki Inoue. Because why not? And you also had the likes of Riccardo Patrese and so on, but I couldn't really make an argument for this dude. Wasn't feeling it. Alright, now we've gone through that band of brothers in the honourable mentions board, let's crack on with the top 10 drivers of the 1990s. And we begin with a driver who is more chin than man. Hailing from Scotland, David Coulthard kicked off his F1 career at the 1994 Monaco Grand Prix, replacing the recently departed Ayrton Senna. He won his first race a year later at the Portuguese Grand Prix, and finished 3rd in the standings that year. Not too bad an effort, and after moving to McLaren in '96, he would continue to make strides, which included 5 Grand Prix victories. Although it paled in comparison to what his teammates were producing, it was still a decent effort overall, especially given the weight of that chin he was forced to lug around. But while he wasn't someone known for being the most naturally gifted driver on the grid, someone who was typically thrown into that argument was Jean Alesi. Alesi was a hell of a driver in the 90s, although he was let down by 2 factors. First was a constant stream of unreliability in whatever machinery he was given. Secondly, and more crucially, himself. Despite this mercurial French attitude, he had a racer's spirit with indomitable will that saw him put in some heroic performances. I suppose it's kind of ironic that he only took 1 Grand Prix victory in his career, which is about 100 million less than what you would think when you watch him drive that thing. Ultimately, let down by himself on occasions is why he's not further up this list, but he is still a well-loved guy in the paddock, and by fans alike. The same is not exactly said for Jacques Villeneuve, because that dude says things. Although that said, he could drive the car pretty well. After winning the IndyCar Series and the Indy 500 in 1995, Frank Williams signed him up to compete in the 1996 Formula 1 season for his team, being his debut race, and about the most unapologetic Canadian to ever walk this planet. Villeneuve took the pole ahead of his heavily favoured teammate, Damon Hill, which came as a bit of a shock to the Formula 1 world, but to him, he knew he could take Damon. Taking his first Grand Prix win at the Nürburgring, he was kind of in contention for the title that year, although when Damon was given the boot at the end of the season, Villeneuve became the new #1 driver, while they brought in Frentzen to be a slave. He won the World Championship that year, although his win at the Nürburgring, with 3 rounds to go, would turn out to be his last Grand Prix victory. From there, Williams lost their dominant streak, and his attempt to make BAR F1's New World Order or whatever the fuck fell flat on its ass. Nevertheless, it was still an impressive stint in this time, and it does warrant some kudos. But while he got his last F1 victory in '97, he wasn't the only driver to have done that, for at the German Grand Prix that year, Gerhard Berger got his final victory after a fantastic career. Berger's 2 teammates throughout the 90s were Jean Alesi and Ayrton Senna. That's a tough act to follow, but he still racked up a handful of victories in his time, and drove well right up until the time he retired at the end of '97. Now, while my personal favourite stories of Berger include the time he threw Senna's briefcase out of a helicopter to see if he could destroy it, his driving was a lot better than some may remember it to be, although he doesn't quite have the same reputation as the Brummy Mammoth. Sacrilege, putting Mansell this far down the list. Well, look, please just hear me out for a bit, because there is no denying that Mansell was a fast driver when he wasn't at his best. When he was though, he was nigh on unbeatable. The thing that ultimately played against him in this list was that he only took part in the first 3 years of the 90s full time, and that Prost mullered him in 1990 whilst driving for Ferrari. But it was a good time to leave, as for the next few years, the prancing horse would be turned into dog food. He found a home at Williams, at a time where they brought in the formidable FW14. In '91, a bunch of retirements at the beginning of the year put him on the back foot, and his playtime in the sandbox at Suzuka gave the title to Senna. But it was clear that the car was fast. All that was needed for him was to not mess up and to have a slave as a teammate. A good thing they had Patrese. 92 was much more successful, as the car was indomitable, and Mansell drove it beautifully. Of course, immediately after winning the world title, he buggered off to the IndyCar scene, coming back sporadically, winning his last Grand Prix at Adelaide in 1994. In his time away, his seat would be taken up by Le Professeur Alain Prost. No one played the political game better than Prost, although the skill came at a bit of a cost in the form of shitting his bridges whenever his plane landed in Brazil. But while he wasn't the most likable dude to ever grace Formula 1, he was a 4-time world champion for a reason. In 1990, he fought with Senna for the title in what was a titanic battle, right up until Senna ignored his brake pedal at Suzuka. I mean, he did convincingly beat teammate Mansell that year, but it was far from ideal to be sent spearing toward the wall because someone had a fit over his grid slot. 1991 wasn't that much more enjoyable either. The car handled like a bus, and hey, they aren't my words. They were his. And because Ferrari are a famously reasonable bunch, they decided to fire him before season's end, sending Alain into a sabbatical. But when Mansell left Williams at the end of 92, Prost took the vacancy and proceeded to win his 4th title. Following his triumphant return, he retired from the sport immediately thereafter, giving the #1 status at Williams to one Damon Hill. When you're following the legacy of one of the best drivers to come out of the 60s, you've got a lot to live up to. But after a season of trying to make sense of the failing Brabham team, he was snapped up by Williams for the 93 season. From there, he would win 21 races for the team, and while his first 2 proper attempts at the title in 94 and 95 came up short, in 96 he would complete a fairy tale, as far as many are concerned. But for him, his world title would not be coupled with a job, as Williams decided to give him the old heave-ho heading into 1997. Hill eventually found a home at, of all teams, Arrows. Arrows were never a race-winning team, and despite having Tom Walkinshaw involved, it wasn't about to start now. The car was stupidly unreliable, and lacked downforce, which is kind of needed in the sport. Having said that, he almost took this thing to victory at the Hungaroring that year, only for the TWR Engineering to remember that it was TWR Engineering, failing on the penultimate lap and handing the victory to Villeneuve. Still though, a podium in an Arrows was still a remarkable effort. He would win one more race in 98, before leaving racing in 1999, the year in which Mika Hakkinen won his 2nd world title. Trying to determine who the greatest Finnish F1 driver of all time is can be a little bit impossible, given the talent that's come out of that country, but someone who will invariably and quite rightly come into the equation is Hakkinen. Debuting for Lotus in 91, there were fears that this talent would not be realised to its full potential, as the team had turned into complete garbage as the 80s drew to a close. But after McLaren fired Michael Andretti toward the end of 93, the team from Woking signed Mika up to race alongside Senna. He stunned everyone by out-qualifying the 3-time world champion on his McLaren debut, and this convinced them to keep Mika on board for the next season. From 94 to 97, the McLarens would prove to be decent, albeit never able to match the likes of Ferrari or Williams. But come 1998, McLaren rocked up with a car that matched Mika's talents, and duly took the MP13 to his first world championship title. He did it again the following year, despite a little bit of bother from Eddie Irvine. His pace was such that Michael Schumacher would remark that Mika was the only driver that he really feared. I mean, hey, of course you would fear a driver who out-qualified Ayrton Senna on debut, because after all, Senna was one of a kind. If you were to ask me who the greatest driver of all time is, my response would be, there is none. There are just too many variables in the sport to adjudicate such a thing. But if you were to ask me who the greatest qualifier of all time is, well, there's quite a good case going for Ayrton. His stint in the 80s made him a legend, although it was the 90s that made him an immortal. You know what I mean. His title win in 1990 was a little interesting, but he was still on form that season, taking 10 poles and 6 victories. His 3rd world title the next year was equally as great, given how strong the Williams pace was starting to get. In 92 and 93, the McLaren just wasn't up to par with Williams. That didn't stop him putting in some Herculean performances, such as at Monaco in 92 or Donington Park in 93. His death at Imola in 94 shocked the motor racing world and reminded us all not only that motor racing is dangerous, but that even the best aren't immune from the consequences either. Had he lived, he may very well have won one more title or 2. In reality, we don't know. What we do know, however, is that he left behind a legacy in the sport that few ever could live up to. If there was one that could, it was the driver that took an ailing team and made it into a powerhouse in the years to come. Prior to 1991, Germany didn't really have a driver in Formula 1 with much in the way of overarching success. Sure, you had the likes of Wolfgang von Trips and Stefan Belloff, both of whom were fantastic drivers, but never got a chance to fulfill their opportunities. With Belloff in particular, he was the hero of a young German who made his Grand Prix debut in 91. When Michael Schumacher took his Jordan 191 around the Spa-Francorchamps circuit, he was an instant hit in the paddock. So much so that by the next round in Monza, Benetton had already signed him up for the remainder of the season and of the next season itself. In 1994, he would win his first world title with Benetton, and his second would come just a year later in 95. He would then be lured over to Ferrari, taking Ross Brawn with him for the 1996 season, and executed a turnaround for the team, which would see it dominate in the following decade. Granted, there was some troubled times for Michael, such as 94 where he ran into Damon, or in 97 where he ran into Villeneuve, or in 1998 where he won the British Grand Prix in somewhat mischievous circumstances. But irrespective, what he accomplished and the drives that he put in was nothing short of incredible. Whether you like him or hate him, what he did in the 90s was part of what made him great. Although remarkably, his best was yet to come. So go on, lynch me in the comments, people. I'm waiting for my hiding. Actually, to be honest, I'd rather you tell me who your top 10 drivers of the 90s were. Let's all be civil about this, please, and don't, kill each other in the comments. Ah, f it. You all know the drill. Drop a comment below, subscribe to the channel if you're awesome, and always remember, keep it respectful, be wholesome, don't be a menace, and as always, I'll see you all later.